Hello, bonjour. Welcome to the Union Safety Net, le filet de sécurité syndicale, a union podcast for working people. I'm your host, Sébastien Bezeau, et oui, parfois en français aussi. This podcast is hosted by the Union of Safety and Justice Employees, le syndicat des employés de la sécurité et de la justice. Join us for an informative discussion every month about issues currently affecting working people. It is estimated that approximately 20 to 45% of public safety personnel have post-traumatic stress disorder, often abbreviated to PTSD, or some other mental health issue. This is a shocking statistic. However, it highlights the impact of the exposure to traumatic experiences and materials and the fundamental need to help this group. In this episode, we learn more about the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment, also known as CIPSRT. For those that are unaware, CIPSRT, which is run out of the University of Regina, provides a forum where all the people concerned about public safety research and treatment can share top-notch data and expand the scope of research. Further, with a focus on public safety personnel, their leadership and family members, CIPSRT also provides access to free, high-quality online intervention tools. To learn more about CIPSRT, joining me today are three fantastic guests. Firstly, Leslie Ann Kewen, PhD and Executive Director of CIPSRT. Leslie Ann, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And then we have Dr. Kimberly Bitts, and she is the Knowledge Mobilization Lead. Dr. Bitts, welcome to the Union Safety Net.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
And finally, last but certainly not least, one of our own, our Regional Vice President, Jeff Sandelli, who is one of the two USJE representatives who serves on the Public Steering Committee of CIPSRT, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Jeff, welcome to the Union Safety Net.
Thanks very much, Seb.
Okay, let's start with the most obvious question for Leslie Ann. What exactly is CIPSRT and how did it begin?
Well, CIPSRT started with an idea. And, as it became obvious that public safety personnel, as you said, were suffering increased levels of PTSD and other mental health conditions, PTSIs, more generically, post-traumatic stress injuries, the government of Canada said, there's something we need to do something about. And with a core set of researchers who had come to the table, including Dr. Nick Carleton, they posted the idea or posited the idea of making CIPSRT. So CIPSRT has been around in the form it is now since about 2018. We're funded by Public Safety Canada, and we provide, as you said, kind of a place for researchers to talk about the work that they do for public safety personnel, and Kimberly will talk more about that, I'm sure, as well as, providing resources, allowing for discussion amongst public safety personnel themselves, and providing online treatment options called PSPNet.
Perfect. Now, that was a lot of information to unpack, but who came up with the $1 million idea? You said it came up with an idea. Where did the idea originate from? Obviously, there was a need, but did you come up with it?
Oh, no, I didn't start here until then. In fact, I was working in federal corrections then. So it was Dr. Nick Carleton and several other researchers, along with Ralph Goodale, who at the time was the public safety minister, and he was from Saskatchewan. And he really has a passion about looking out for public safety personnel. And so they were the kind of forces that got CIPSRT going.
Very interesting. Thank you for that additional information. One more question for you, Leslie Ann. I understand that USG's members, by virtue of not being typical first responders, they did not necessarily come to mind when CIPSRT was first conceived. What is the composition of CIPSRT now?
So CIPSRT serves 9 sectors, public safety personnel. So corrections, what we're talking about today, which includes all correctional workers and staff. So even if parole officers, but also administrative staff, because it's not just, if you read, have to file paperwork or write reports or read reports, you're being affected, whether you realize, it's in a different way, but a similar way to those who are experiencing incidents themselves. traumatic incidents themselves. It also covers paramedics and paramedicine. And I'm going to miss some of them, I'm sure.
Of course, when you begin to list, yes.
Search and rescue, police, fire, emergency management, border security. And I think what's evolved since the origin of CIPSRT is the addition that it's not just a traditional frontline. When we think of first responders and frontline, what we think of, it's this whole group of individuals, whether they're working directly on the front line or not, that are important because they're all experiencing these kinds of things and these traumatic events. And it's called vicarious trauma. So basically this happens when you're not involved in the event itself, the incident itself, but you're reading about it. Someone you know is involved in it. You're involved in an investigation. You're writing a report. You're supervising a parolee where you had to read about the incidents that involved them. And so it's this kind of recognition now that it's much more than what we think of as the core frontline responders.
Indeed, we've come a long way in expanding that definition, and I'm sure Jeff Sandelli would like to jump on that and talk about the expansion and the need to expand the definition. But Jeff, before we get to that, you know, there's a public safety steering committee. I'm not sure if it's part of CIPSRT or outside, and that's where USG can contribute. So how can you explain your role on that steering committee and what the role is all about?
Yeah, for sure. The standing committee is made up of representatives, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal, representing public safety personnel. And that's both on the labor side as well as on the employer side. So it's a group, you know, you'd see police, fire, paramedics, but you also have folks there representing call takers, search and rescue, potentially other groups, and USJE representing 20,000 very unique public safety personnel. So that group gets together and they work together sort of outside of CIPSRT because it's more than that. They're providing strategic advice, consultation to groups like the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment, but also the Canadian Institute for Health Research when there's potential funding and research that's going to be done, as well as to Public Safety Canada. So the idea is that the standing committee is going to be helping these groups determine where to go so that they understand what the front line needs and what research is going to be most impactful at the front line. It's very unique in that you have these a multitude of public safety groups, labor and employer together, and we're trying to identify these broad topics or hotspots. So it's not just about the specific sector. You're trying to think more broadly and then provide that direction to these groups that really need it in order to make good decisions.
It sounds like an amazing place for good collaboration within like-minded people. Moving on to Dr. Bitts, how do academics, researchers, and clinicians participate in CIPSRT?
Well, there's two kind of different modes. We have our informal and our formal participation. So we have the ArcNet, which is a community of practice that we host, which is kind of I would say, the opportunity for people to get together, share knowledge, share information, participate in some educational presentations as well. But then our more informal is where we're really taking the research that all of these amazing researchers nationally are doing, and we're compiling that and using it to inform the work that we do here. So we use that evidence base to inform the development of resources. And then when the clinicians kind of come in, is we're looking at them to ground that research in the real world experience. So they participate in our webinars and our panel presentations, and they help bring that frontline perspective to what we're providing to people and making sure that what we're doing is responsive and really relevant to the people that we serve. So it's sort of this like circle that's sort of feeding back into, right? So the researchers are coming together, they're bringing us this amazing work. The clinicians are validating that work. And then we're all kind of working together to make sure that we're providing a strong foundation for what we provide to the PSP.
Well, it's definitely relevant information because I know we share the tools and resources with our members regularly. So, and to go further down that line, as we mentioned off the top of the show, CIPSRT provides access to free online tools and resources. I'll repeat, free online tools and resources developed by top-notch academics and researchers. You cannot ask for anything better. Could you tell us a bit more about them and where they can be accessed?
Sure. So the key resource that we have is our PSPNet, and that's the internet-based cognitive behavioral therapy. So that's kind of one of the gold standards for treatment of mental health challenges. And it, again, like you've mentioned, it's free. So that's a really important piece. It's free. It's confidential. You don't need a referral. It's very accessible. So PSPNet offers therapist-guided and self-guided courses for PSP as well as PSP spouses. So I think that's a really important one, and that can be found under the PSPNet website. So I'm sure those resources, links to those resources will get shared for people. But you can also go to the CIPSRT page and it'll steer you towards there as well. In addition to the PSPNet, we also have a lot of other resources available. So we have a wide variety of different resources that cover different topics, from managing stress and trauma, building resistance, navigating those really unique challenges that public safety roles are faced. There's self-assessment tools, tip sheets, and a lot of webinar series. So every webinar we do, we record. It's posted to the website so people can watch those on their own time, which is really important because we all know PSP shift work can be very challenging and make it very difficult to access those things. So those are there. And those webinars range from everything from moral injury to family wellness and sleep. There's a really great sleep resources available. And again, those are all available through the CIPSRT website. They're free, which is fantastic.
No, it's an amazing list of resources. As you were just listing them, I was just ticking off the list in my mind. I'm like, what else could you do? I don't think there's any other options. And for our listeners, all the tools will be listed in our episode summary. Please feel free to visit the CIPSRT website. Even just looking at the researchers, the staff, everyone involved, it's quite impressive to see everyone coming together with their backgrounds on this important topic. We'll go to Leslie Ann for the next question about public safety personnel, because they're often described as unsung heroes in a variety of fora. How accurate is this description of the work undertaken by operational personnel, particularly those who aren't uniformed frontline members?
I mean, the unsung heroes, we've heard from many PSP that they don't really like the word hero. They think they're doing their job. But putting that aside, I do think there are all kinds of personnel who do things that aren't in uniform. So I'll draw my own experience. I worked in federal corrections and CSC for a number of years, and my team investigated escapes, overdoses. We wrote the annual report on deaths in custody, so we looked at every death that occurred in custody, and we worked with the structured intervention unit teams. And you would think, well, okay, that's not frontline, and they're researchers. How would that affect them? But we had to read every autopsy report, every incident report, all the parole, if there was an escape, all the kind of assessments, and that is a form of trauma. You're reading those over and over and over again. And even if you're an administrative assistant who's having to file those or, kind of put them up on so that they're available on the internal systems for review, you're experiencing forms of trauma that way. And so I think it's really important that we recognize that in many ways, although unsung heroes may not describe them, they are as important to the public safety personnel universe as uniformed personnel. Just think about the 911 operator who takes a call. We wouldn't traditionally think of those as first responders, but they're listening to the person on the phone. They're, it may be at the most difficult points in someone's life where they're experiencing high amounts of trauma because of that. And many of them never know what happens. So they have this this unfinished business, so to speak, right? Because they don't know what the outcome of whatever the event was. And so it was important to expand those definitions to include people who wouldn't necessarily wear a uniform, but who were constantly being exposed to these similar kinds of trauma.
Jeff, the door has been open for you and the USJE's presumptive injury campaign. Like Leslie Ann just explained it, a lot of people who don't necessarily wear the uniform, frontline members, do face traumatic incidents or have to read material. So what can be done to mitigate the impact? How can we help them?
Well, I think there's the proactive mechanisms that can be done, and that's some of the research. So maybe I'll talk about that first. I really feel, based on my experience and having had the opportunity to attend even the most recent CIPSRT's conference and talking with other public safety personnel, we come into this work, regardless of what that work is, whether it's administrative or frontline, and there's a particular way that job is being done. And that's the way the job continues to be done. The mechanisms, the way you accomplish tasks, you do it in a particular way. And we know that this particular way, in most cases, there's damage that's happening. It's a cumulative impact. And we don't know when that might come out and become a stress injury. I think when we look at longitudinal studies, in particular, I think of the RCMP study that's being done, and they start to see that there's some applications that can actually help mitigate some of those things. So you look at something like journaling, they're seeing how this can help mitigate some of the damage. And so you start to think, well, if you start to build in ideas such as journaling into your job expectation, and it doesn't just have to be journaling, and I don't want to get into how the employer would manage that, but just the idea of building something in that could actually help protect you. I think this is the direction we have to go in a proactive manner, to start looking at doing these jobs differently and implementing pieces that actually help protect you as part of your day. On the more reactive side, I think what you were alluding to is USJE currently has a presumptive injury campaign, which folks can go to ptsiatwork.ca or keepingcanadianssafe.ca to read a bit more about. But essentially, federal public safety personnel are not treated equally across Canada. They work for the federal government, but the Government Employee Compensation Act essentially contracts the provinces to assess, administer the WCB, WSIB programs in those provinces. So that means where some provinces might provide a good presumptive coverage, many do not. Many provide presumptive coverage to police, fire, and paramedic. That is, if they face a psychological injury, it's presumed it's as a result of the work they are doing, and they get immediate service. Our workers don't get that consistently and sometimes face denial and then the uphill battle of trying to appeal and get the services that they need to get better. We want the Government Employee Compensation Act to be open up, the definition of public safety personnel to be modified, and that they are given presumptive coverage regardless of the province that they're in. So again, they can get healthy, they can get back to work, they can continue protecting Canadians.
So that's the union perspective. Thank you, Jeff, for that. Let's go to CIPSRT. And Dr. Bitts, what would be CIPSRT's response? How can we mitigate the impact?
I think the biggest thing just comes from raising that awareness and helping people to understand the importance of minding their mental health. So we had a webinar yesterday. We talked a little bit about this, where we said sometimes it's important to take a proactive approach to all things. So I use the analogy of brushing your teeth. We don't wait until we have a toothache and go to the dentist. We all brush our teeth every day, right? We're engaging in those proactive strategies. And from our perspective, it would be the same. So check out the resources that we have before you feel like you have a problem. Talk to a therapist before you have a problem, right? If we all learn coping tools, strategies ahead of time, it makes it much easier to manage as we go forward.
Okay, last question about the CIPSRT conference. You just had a conference held in May, I believe. I know at USGE we were promoting it last year already, and we had wrote up a nice article. We had some regional vice presidents who attended. We even had some union members, frontline, who attended. So we'll begin with Dr. Bitts to see what's your take on the CIPSRT conference. How did it go? And then we'll go to Leslie Ann and we'll finish with Jeff just to celebrate that big conference that happened.
Well, from my perspective, the conference was highly successful. I have the privilege of being the one that reads through all of the survey results and reading all of the individual comments, and it was overwhelmingly positive. There were several takeaways that were really, really important. One was for us to know that there is a huge demand for really practical and accessible mental health tools. So the feedback that we got was really, really informative and will help shape the future direction of CIPSRT's knowledge mobilization strategy, so we can continue to tailor those resources for our PSP. And we welcome all of that commentary and feedback from people as they look at the resources. I do encourage people to reach out. The other thing that was really a standout was the strength and the impact of the networking that took place. So even while we were on site, people were coming up and saying, thank you for this. I realize now I'm not alone. And I think that right there is so, so important. We recognize the value of community and connection, right? So the conference really was helpful for that. And it helped us to see that there's this incredible community of people doing all of this amazing work. And when we all come together, we can put all of this into action, right? That was the main thing. So it was really nice to see that we can create some meaningful change.
And you can create new practices. I know we USGE as a union, as an employer, we learned from CIPSRT's conference where you even had on the table some contact information if people needed some mental health support during the conference. So we replicated that idea. It was an amazing idea to help and protect our members when they come to our equity conference. So it's just small example like that makes a big difference. Leslie Ann, what was your key takeaway from that conference?
Kimberly said this well. It was about community. And I think to me, that was really important. So often when you see yourself, and we talk about the sectors like corrections and paramedics, etc., we focus sometimes on the differences. But in fact, what I think I felt there and what many expressed was, oh, wow, like paramedics are experiencing many of the same things that correctional officers are or parole officers. And that there was power in that, in recognizing that there was this community and that they could share with each other. I think some of the other comments about the conference and things that were really key takeaways is that we really need to spend some more time on sleep. So there was a really amazing presentation by Dr. Carney on sleep. And with her help, we produced some kind of, cards with tips on them and that kind of thing. But to me, that was one of the key takeaways, was that this is an important area for PSP. I can tell you that myself from personal experience, and that they need some specific resources and help with that. And so I'm happy that many of those resources are now on the CIPSRT website, and we can send them out to people's work locations that they would like. They just need to ask. And I think the other piece was really summed up by our closing keynote speaker, Evan Bray. And really, he issued a challenge to all those involved, especially leaders, about the importance of kind of not just paying lip service to needing to support in employees and in their work, but actually making mental health supports part of just an integrated strategy, as important as physical health, as important as all those other things, and just that they had an important role to play in doing that, but that we could also all act as leaders by, making sure we're supporting each other, supporting our colleagues, making sure that we've informed ourselves. And so I think coming away from that, it was the energy of community I thought was really exciting. And as Kimberly said, it will help CIPSRT figure out how we continue to support public safety personnel, how we grow this community into something that's supportive amongst each other.
No, thank you for that explanation and your take on the conference results. Jeff, from your union's perspective, and you were there with some of your colleagues, some of your union members, what was the key takeaway from their perspective?
Well, I think that, there's some bias in my response. Part of the collaboration of the standing committee or the public safety committee is that some of us collaborated with CIPSRT in the development. And so I was just extremely excited at the prospect. And then when we saw the many hundreds of people filling this room, I was, quite taken by the success that continued to sort of evolve through it, which was everybody's sort of at a different place in terms of their understanding of where the research is. And now you had this room filled with people opening the conversation in some sense, having dialogue with other public safety personnel, comments of, I'd never really thought of that, sharing perspective, and then learning from these tremendous speakers. And so largely what I heard was positive. And I think too, there's so many takeaways from that conference, but I think of some of the things folks have said to me subsequently, when they learn of things such as on CIPSRT's website, under the resources tab, there's the self-assessment tools. And a number of people have said, I've just started to go there once in a while to check in. And how successful is that? Because that's proactive. Because I think in my experience, as we continue to evolve, most often we're providing advice and support after something has happened. So if one of the takeaways is people start to take care of themselves, they start to check in, they start to consider options, they start to question, is my sleep pattern being impacted? Is my mental health being impacted? And they start to look into it, that's success. And so that's some of what I've taken away from that conference.
Very powerful.
Seb, maybe I could just add, I think it was so important for us that we had people like Jeff who were involved in organizing this, that it isn't CIPSRT saying this is what you should do, but we're trying to take public safety personnel into account even in the organizing of it, not, for you, but with you, as the saying goes. And I think that's an absolute important takeaway that, we highly value the input from others. So if you're out there and you say, I could really use a resource on, or it would really be helpful for me to understand, CIPSRT wants to hear that. Contact us on the website or reach out to one of us. We need to hear that because we want to make sure that what we're doing is relevant to each person who's serving in one of these jobs.
So there's the call to action to our listeners. Always reach out to CIPSRT if you need some mental health support, if you're a PSP, or also if you have suggestions on topics of research or anything they can assist with. So to wrap up the episode, I want to thank Leslie Ann Kewen, Dr. Kimberly Bitts, and Jeff Sandelli for taking part in our podcast episode on the CIPSRT, the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment. Thank you for having participated on the Union Safety Net.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Merci. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Union Safety Net, Le Filet de Sécurité Syndicale, a union podcast created by USJE for working people. If you have any feedback on today's episode or would like to suggest a topic you want us to cover, please reach out on social media platforms. We love to hear from our listeners. I'm your host, Sébastien Bezeau, and I hope you'll join us next month for another episode of the Union Safety Net, Le Filet de Sécurité Syndicale.